We are speaking with Jack Valenti, who is currently the president of the Motion Picture Association of America. Mr. Valenti was very close to Lyndon Johnson in the campaign, in the appearances of the president and vice president in Texas leading up to the assassination. And you were there. You were in the motorcade. You were in the hospital, one of the people closest to the new president of the United States. What was it like on that afternoon in Dallas? You were riding in the motorcade. What do you remember about that day?
Well, like everybody else, that day is vivid and scarring in my memory. Everybody in America knows where they were that day. I was about 8 cars back. The atmosphere was friendly, hospitable. There wasn't a hostile face in the crowd. And suddenly, as we neared the underpass, the motorcade became a freeway. The car in front of us began to go 40 to 50 miles an hour instead of 10 miles an hour. We knew something desperately was wrong. And at that time, each of us in that car didn't want to ask ourselves the unanswerable question, something has happened. I thought that maybe someone had thrown a rock at the president's car and that they were getting out of there fast. I went on to the Trade Mart, ordered the car to go to the Trade Mart where President Kennedy was going to speak. And when we got there, we learned that the president had been shot, Governor Connolly had been shot. No one knew how seriously. And I commandeered a deputy sheriff's car and went to Parkland Hospital immediately. I was with Mrs. Lincoln, President Kennedy's secretary. My agency had handled the logistics of the trip to Texas with the president and the vice president. And I'd been very close to Lyndon Johnson, though I had not worked for him.
I welcome this kind of examination.
Round up the usual suspects.
They are who we thought they were, and we let them off the hook.
Do it live. I'll write it and we'll do it live.
You know, they do this to me all the time. I don't know what the hell they do it for, but goddamn it, if we can't come out of a slow record, I don't understand it. Is Don on the phone?
That it is immoral and wrong that the top 1/10 of 1% in this country own almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%.
I think there's blame on both sides, and I have no doubt about it.
They will note merely that I was among the senators who determined that what the president did was wrong.
Meeting in the middle of the desert always made me nervous. It's a scary place.
Whoever told you that you could work with men?
If ISIS started a streaming service, you'd call your agent.
And for the international order that we have worked for generations to build.
It's morning again in America.
This is the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hi, this is Philip Nelson, author of the book Remember the Liberty. You're listening to the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm S.T. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing and traversing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking head, the court historians, and the textbook conglomerates that control information today. And yes, they still continue to control information today. Well, tonight we have episode 178, Cory Hughes on the JFK assassination. But first, however, let us clean this castle if we shall. Now, Garrison issue 14 is available on the regular sites now. If you've bought one before, you know where to go. If you don't have that Lulu link, and it's probably too long to read here verbatim on the show, but you can go to Midnight Rider News. That's writer with a T as in a person who writes. MidnightRiderNews.com. I love Patrick Lawrence's cover story on the long-term effects of the Durham Report, and it's really interesting. It's a good, pretty wise take, and I think you're going to like it too. Ed Tatero's one of a kind, and his piece is, again, phenomenal, and this is no surprise to anyone. It's a must-read. But there is so much more, but I think I want to leave that to you to find, for you to discover, and for you to come back and say, wow. Because even when I read it, when I'm laying the magazine out, I am usually surprised at how much I like each and every article. So I think that you will too. Go to MidnightRiderNews.com for that. Now, I really want to get to this interview, so let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back with Cory Hughes.
This is Casey Quinlan, the co-author of Beyond the Fence Line, the eyewitness account of Ed Hoffman and the murder of President Kennedy. For more on Otto Skorzeny, the most dangerous man in Europe, Operation Gladio, the ZR rifle program, and the identity of QJ Wynn, listen to episode 118 of the Midnight Rider News Show.
This is Brian Edwards, co-author of Beyond the Fence Line, the eyewitness account of Ed Hoffman and the murder of President Kennedy. For more on the tactical considerations that made Dealey Plaza an ideal field of fire for the Kennedy assassins, listen to episode 119 of the Midnight Rider News Show.
We are 178 episodes into the show's history. Yes, there was a time when I wondered and hoped we would get past 5. So I think this is good, to be optimistic. And I've only received hate mail about 3 episodes. And you can probably guess which episodes they are. Those happen to be the 3 episodes I've done with Dr. Jim Fetzer. He sort of does that to people sometimes, and I have a feeling that this may be the 4th. Now, I heard Cory Hughes first on a podcast on YouTube, and I instantly said, man, this guy has some unique takes. And while YouTube is obviously rife with bombastic hot takes on everything from Cleopatra to Anthony Weiner, not many of them are backed up with information. Now, I hate to call anything a fact these days, as it's a term that's been almost as maligned as conspiracy theory. You know, people have their own way of using information and spinning information and half using half information and misconstruing information. So facts automatically assume that if someone is using a fact, that it is a truth. And as we all know, that's not always the case. But most people saying these bombastic things on YouTube don't even come with any information. They just have opinion. That is not Cory Hughes. He does come with information, and you're going to hear a lot of it tonight. Now, much of what you hear will be things that you hear for the first time. There'll be takes on the JFK assassination that you may have never heard before. And, for me personally, there was a lot of, man, I've never heard that before as well. And there was a lot of, wow, I think that's a new take. I wonder how he's going to explain this. Yet every time he did explain it, and he explained it in full. And so I think that's what really made me want to have him on the show for you, because I think that even if you disagree with a few of the takes, I think you're going to like the amount of information that he brings. And I think he's going to cause you to really rethink some things. And I think that's always educational. I think that should be a part of your educational process, is for you not to do a little research and then put yourself in a corner of an idea and then stay in that corner and keep defending that corner for decade after decade after decade. I don't think that's wise, and I don't think that's smart. I think that you should be the one who challenges yourself most. And if you're confident with your skills as a researcher and as a thinker, I think that's very healthy. And so I think it's healthy for us to listen to people like Cory Hughes. And I'm really glad that you're going to do that tonight, because he will not provide you with any confirmation bias for what you already think about the case. I can guarantee you that. But I think it's going to be a fascinating ride for us all. So let's go ahead and bring him in right now. Cory, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. I love to do it.
And we're happy to have you. We like that you like doing it. And I usually start this way because it fascinates me how people become researchers on a case. Because it's not just a matter of having sort of a passing interest, or that you like to watch the documentaries on the History Channel, or that you have a couple books. Like, when people become so interested in a case that they actually become a researcher or an expert on that case, it's a pretty interesting choice to make in life, because you're then deciding that a lot of your time will be devoted to this one thing, to almost to the point where you could call it a hobby, although I know a lot of researchers don't really like to be called hobbyists. But the point is that we all have an interesting origin story in this case. What's yours?
Sure. Well, like everyone else, I became fascinated with Kennedy because of the JFK movie, which is the utmost in irony, and maybe we'll get to that later because that movie was intended to be a propaganda film. And so my whole life I kind of like, dabbled in not heavy research, but I had read a couple of the standard books from the literature. And, I thought I had a fairly good idea of what I call the official conspiracy theory, because make no mistake about it, the official conspiracy theory is just that. It's the official conspiracy theory. It is what is pushed by COINTELPRO actors. And that's where you get like the CIA killed Kennedy over Vietnam, which is so ignorant of a statement and conclusion to make. It's ridiculous. Kennedy just spent $6 billion on helicopters and airplanes. He was not pulling out of anything. So anybody who likes to think that we were pulling out of Vietnam because of Kennedy doesn't understand how to read a budget line item. So the reality is that Kennedy wasn't pulling out of anything. And people who I found that people put Kennedy in that the CIA killed him camp are all in a single camp. They don't understand the CIA. They don't understand the origins of the CIA and who the CIA really works for. And that's crucial if you're going to say the CIA killed Kennedy, right? Like that's such a cop out. Who in the CIA, right? I mean, I can tell you who in the CIA did what, but most people can't. It's just a broad generalization. But I had spent about, I got into history about 2015. I spent about 3 years on World War II and the Holocaust. And if you study the Holocaust, it will inevitably lead you to the doorsteps of Kennedy. And that's another connection that most people don't seem to be able to make, but it is nonetheless there. And so I started it's been 5 years almost exactly, July 2018, I started full-time Kennedy research. And I spent 3 years, 7 days a week in the books like it was my life. Not even my job, my life. Like there were times I couldn't even I couldn't wait to get to the next page in the documents to the point where I would fall asleep with my laptop on my chest. And then I'd wake up in the morning and just get right to it. Not even like get up and use the bathroom or nothing. I mean, it was obsession for 3 years. And then the last 2, I've been formulating my book, which will be out. I'm on the last chapter. I'm on the final chapter on Jack Valenti. And once it's done, it should be out hopefully a month from now, 6 weeks tops, maybe.
Well, great. I can't wait to read that. It's no surprise to anyone out there that I have a serious issue with the self-appointed hierarchy in this JFK community. And I need to emphasize this because this is important. Not the lay people who, for the most part, are fantastic and they're conscientious and they're generous and they care greatly about this case. And they also do a lot of hard work around this case, a lot of important work that goes unknown because they aren't one of the big names. And so who I'm talking about are the self-appointed is the self-appointed hierarchy that really believes that they are the ultimate gatekeepers of the knowledge here, that they're the holders of the sacred key, so to speak.
Yep.
And it's just all so ridiculous that even at conferences, these attendees who know who they are may oogle at them some, but the hotel staff, for example, the hotel staff couldn't tell you who they are at all. They have no idea who these people are. They've never heard of them and they will never hear of them. And so that alone tells you how important they really are in the grand scheme of things.
Well, I've been kicked out of every single JFK forum, Facebook group. It's just unbelievable because the split second you're talking about real facts and like you break from the dogma of the Kennedy researchers and you start to present real factual information. You point out, hey, you dummies, you should have figured this out 50 years ago because it's been out for 50 years. Why didn't you figure it out? And it's like that was one of the things that really got me when I started, because when I started back in 2018, in the first year, I had cracked the Winterland ice arena, the ice skating rink David Ferry allegedly went to. And I'm like, nah, there's no way I figured out the Winterland. It's been 60 years. Somebody else had to have figured this out. But no, nobody did. Nobody figured out the Winterland. Let me ask you a question. Do you know who owned the Winterland ice rink that David Ferry allegedly went ice skating in? Lyndon Johnson, the Johnson family enterprise, owned the Winterland. And the Winterland had been started by a woman named Mary Boots Roberts. Mary Boots Roberts and her husband at the time, Ronnie Roberts, were like world famous ice skaters. They had skated with Ice Capades, Disney on Ice, Ice Follies. And so because of their direct friendship with Lyndon Johnson, he paid for and owned the Winterland ice skating rink. And so by the time the assassination happens, right, who's running the rink at the time? Well, David Ferry allegedly goes there, but let me give you a hint. He never went to the Winterland. But allegedly David Ferry goes there and he meets with a guy named Chuck Rowland, whose name is not Roland Chuck Rowland. His name is actually Rulon, R-U-L-O-N Chuck Rowland. He was a French-Canadian, half-Korean figure skater, very famous on that same circuit. And so, but he was married to a woman named Joyce Rowland. And it was Joyce Rowland who allegedly was running the Winterland at the time. But when you go through like when you lay out the ownership of the Winterland and you get to who was running it, which when it was started, it was Mary Boots Roberts, but then it was turned into Joyce Rowland. But when you do an analysis of the life of Mary Boots Roberts, what you'll find is that her birth name was Mary Caltagirone. And so that kind of struck me as a name that was familiar to me. I couldn't place why. Well, in studying Jack Valenti, it turns out Jack Valenti's sister, Lorraine Valenti, who went on to become Lorraine Valenti Dinerstein, she actually married a man named Vincent Caltagirone Jr. And I couldn't believe it. I was like, oh my God, what a coincidence, right? But of course, there's no coincidences in history. And so when you start to dig into Mary Caltagirone, you find out that Mary Caltagirone, a.k.a. Mary Boots Roberts, has a first cousin named Vincent Caltagirone Jr. Vincent Caltagirone Jr. was the short tramp in Dealey Plaza, and he was ID'd by James Earl Ray as Raoul. So yes, I've been able to identify the real Raoul through the relationship with Mary Boots Roberts and statements that were made by Raoul about making $1 million with Jack Valenti, who was his former brother-in-law, married to his sister. So so I cracked that in the first year, and I'm like, what the hell have these people been doing for 50 years? This is the most important discovery in Kennedy, and no one's ever discovered it until now. And I was like, this can't be. I was like, this has to be. I spent probably a month trying to debunk my own information because I'm like, there's no way that these people didn't figure this out. But no, they didn't figure it out. And so understanding the relationship between Lyndon Johnson and the fact that the Winterland was a CIA front used for child trafficking, because the CIA obviously runs the human trafficking organizations that have been going on. And David Ferry and Jack Valenti were all caught up in that stuff. So yeah, it's Kennedy is like will lead you to a million other things that are never talked about in Kennedy.
Oh yes, and while you're on it, the three tramps. You said he was the short tramp in Dealey Plaza. While we're here, and so that I don't forget to ask you later, who are the other two?
The old tramp is Leo Mosseri. Leo Mosseri is he was working for James Licavoli, who was the underboss to John Scalise in Cleveland. And so that's the chain of command. It goes from Licavoli, who is also photographed in Dealey Plaza, to Leo Mosseri, and to the tall tramp, who was Danny Green, the Irishman. Most people don't know this, but like Danny Green, he was a sniper trainer in the Marines. Okay. So when you study Danny Green, you come to realize that he gets out of the Marines and he goes and he works for the Genovese family in New York. He goes and he works on the railroads. For some reason, he gets traded to Cleveland to work for James Licavoli. It is there while he is there as a nobody. Before anyone knows who Danny Green is, he takes part in the assassination. Now, I'm assuming he takes part in the assassination because he was the tall tramp. He was a sniper trainer in the Marines. And then after the assassination, and there's a great article that you can find in the Detroit Free Press on this. There's an article about Danny Green talking about him, how he came out of nowhere to take over the Longshoresmen Union, the largest union in Cleveland, which in New York was being run by Albert Anastasia. So you can see the kind of level that he's being put on immediately after the assassination, right? So he was rewarded just like everybody else. Just like Jack Valenti was rewarded with the White House in Hollywood, Danny Green was rewarded with the Longshoresmen Union. And this was years before he had his falling out with the Cleveland mob. And then, he ends up getting whacked by them in a car bombing, right? But like I posted something on the education forum about this, and like nobody had any clue what I was talking about. Everyone was like making fun of me because they're like, Danny Green didn't work with the Cleveland mob. I'm like, Jesus Christ, this is like talking to a bunch of children. So, but yeah, so that's who the tramps were. The tramps I have a whole chapter dedicated to. They got funneled right out the back door. There's a lot of shenanigans because there were two sets of tramps arrested. There was the initial set of tramps that was arrested at 12:35 p.m. immediately after the assassination. You're talking about what are those guys' names? I always forget those guys' names. The three bums who they identified and tried to say were the tramps. So those guys were arrested. It was like Gedney, right? Forrester Gedney and all those guys. So they were arrested at 12:35. And then when you follow like who handled them and whatnot, those guys end up actually going to jail. They spend 6 days in jail before getting released. So But there's some confusion there because you have two stories, right? The second set of tramps, which is the tramps that we all know, that didn't happen till the call didn't go out till 1:56 p.m. And so they're not even on scene till after 2. And they're arrested and they're brought back to the station and they are funneled out the back door of the sheriff's office. Like straight up, the sheriff just let him out the back door. And so that's how that story went down. And so with Vincent Caltagirone, I believe part of the trip, because David Ferry was in Dallas. He never went to the Winterland. And that whole story is pretty interesting because you figure that out because of the statements of Thomas Compton and Thomas Compton's roommate, Frank J. Chilona, up in Hammond, Louisiana. So David Ferry is he's one of 2 shooters on the grassy knoll. He fires a throat shot. He throws his rifle to Andrew Jerome Blackman, who then breaks it down. He's the railroad man, puts it in the toolbox. He then walks into Dealey Plaza, where he's photographed standing on the pergola. He then walks back through the railroad yards, where he's photographed again in the railroad yards, cutting back to his car, which is the light gray Plymouth owned by Carl Mathers of Collins Radio, which was a CIA company, right? So David Ferry is in his car behind the book depository, and he's seen by a witness named Velma. The identity of Velma, potentially Robert McEwen's wife, but who knows? We'll get into that a whole nother time. But Velma basically calls into a radio show, Coast to Coast, back in like 2002, 2003, tells this story how she sees the guy in the gray Plymouth with the real heavy eyebrows, okay? Real heavy eyebrows, talks to Tippett, and then him and Tippett go off behind a building and they have a conversation. Of course, that was David Ferry. The descriptions match, the vehicles match from from behind the book depository to the Tippett shooting, where Tippett is then shot by Kerry Thornley and David Ferry. Kerry Thornley then flees, tries to get into the secondhand junk shop on Jefferson, then goes to the Abundant Life Temple, then heads to the Texas Theater. David Ferry ends up leaving from the Tippett shooting and heads to the address on Belmont in Fort Worth, the same address where David Wayne House and Philip Glenn Wilson get arrested, right? That's the house up on Belmont. And so that's the same house where the light-colored Ford Falcon station wagon is parked when the cops show up on scene. And that's the car that David Ferry leaves from Dallas to drive to Hammond, Louisiana. And the entire Winterland story was a cover story. It was meant to create an alibi for David Ferry, because David Ferry was in Dallas and then he went to Hammond. He did not actually end up going to Houston at all, and he only went to Galveston very briefly Saturday night to check into the Driftwood Motel for Sergei Arcacha, who was actually the man who went to the Winterland, along with Leighton Martins and Alvin Bobouf. Of course, they used the alias of Melvin Coffee. Okay, that's an alias. Like, people can just forget about Melvin Coffee entirely. It's purely an alias. And how the alias game works is that you use names of real people whom you know, who have a similar description, whom you can share so the cops will never know who it was, right? 100% of the guys who David Ferry surrounded himself with were 5'7" to 5'9", 130 to 150 pounds, light brown hair. Their descriptions were completely interchangeable. This became evident to me when you looked into the service station in Port Arthur on the trip home to New Orleans. So, yeah, the Kennedy assassination is one masterpiece of tradecraft, right? People so often tried to take everything at face value, and they can't take anything at face value. Nobody is where they said they were. Jack Ruby isn't even Jack Ruby half the time. Half the time, Jack Ruby is actually Samuel Ruby. So we've all seen the photographs of Jack Ruby in the hallway of the police department. We've seen Jack Ruby at the midnight press conference. Well, I hate to break it to you. That's not Jack Ruby. That's Jack Ruby's brother, Samuel Ruby. Jack Ruby went to Galveston because Jack Ruby had to take Jerome Blackman back to his boat. Right. So the heroin guy who was bringing in the heroin that was going to meet up with Rose Jeremy and all that was Andrew Jerome Blackman, who's a longtime associate of David Ferry. That becomes pretty obvious that it was him when you look into Jerome Blackman. You figure out he was interrogated the Tuesday after the assassination. He was part of the Merchant Marine. The heroin coming in was connected to a guy named Black Stone. Black Stone was referenced in the David Ferry file in a letter David Ferry wrote to Andrew Jerome Blackman, right? So it's like 2 + 2 = 4 here. None of this is rocket science. And if people take the time to actually go through the documents, they'll be able to make these same connections too. Which brings me back to why haven't anyone else figured this out in 50 freaking years. So, but yeah, the entire Galveston trip was tradecraft. I mean, every single part of this was just like drenched in body doubles and dead drops and license plate swaps. When you get into like the Tippett shooting and then the cars that went to Galveston and to Houston, you're dealing with 2 cars. You're dealing with a light blue Mercury Comet that David Ferry owned, right? And then you're also dealing with a light blue Ford Falcon, which is identified not only in Dallas at the Belmont address, but also by Thomas Compton as he left Hammond, right? So you have 2 cars. And what's the interesting thing about the Mercury Comet and the blue Ford Falcon. They're identical vehicles with different branding. Okay, so very easy to do swaps. All you do is swap a license plate and people are going to think you're driving a Mercury, not a Ford, which is exactly what they did on the trip. They did license plate swaps when David Ferry got to Galveston. So yeah, the study of Kennedy is the study of relationships, and it's the study of tradecraft, deception. They get you to look to the left while everything goes on to the right. And so, yeah, I don't even know what the hell I'm talking about. I go off on tangents sometimes, but all that was connected. So
no, you're fine. You're fine. And what I like about what you're doing is that you are saying that it's in the document. So if anyone out there questions what you're saying or questions where you're going with it, they can also go back and look at those same documents. Now, you're talking about who shot and from which location they shot. So why don't you just sort of take us around Dealey and tell us who shot from where?
Sure. The first shot came from David Ferry. He was standing at the picket fence on the grassy knoll. He shot Kennedy in the throat. From there, he throws the rifle to Blackman, who breaks it down, and the whole series of events I talked about him cutting back behind the railroad yards. From there, you have a barrage of bullets. I would say probably 9 to 10 shots minimum, because they extracted from the limo no less than 5 or 6 bullets beyond the 3 that we're ever told about, plus other fragments and this and that. So there was at least 9 or 10 shots fired. Like, that's just unquestionable. When you get to the book depository, on the 6th floor, you have Lawrence Howard and Loren Hall. Lawrence Howard was pretty easy to identify because all throughout the Kennedy assassination literature, going back to starting in January of 61 at Bolton Ford, you have sightings of Oswald. Well, we know Oswald was in the Soviet Union in 61 till, 62? And we'll get into the program that Oswald was involved in. Actually, let me take a break right here, and we'll get into Oswald really quickly because it's very relevant. Oswald was part of one of 2 programs. I've narrowed it down to either the Redskin program or the AE Balcony program. Both programs were involved in getting a spy into the Soviet Union. The AE Balcony program particularly involved in getting spies into the Baltic nations like Belarus and Estonia, Latvia, that kind of thing. And where did Oswald end up? In Minsk, right? So, but that program, AE Balcony, came to an end in June of 62. When did Oswald come back to the States? June 1st of 62. Okay, right. So the program ended the day that he came back to the States, right? So it's pretty obvious that Oswald was part of one of these 2 programs. He was probably a Redskin defector under the AE Balcony program, right? So, but I don't even remember how I got there. But getting back to the book depository, you have Lawrence Howard on the 6th floor. All of the witnesses who saw people on the 6th floor identified a dark complected, husky-looking Latin. Arnold Roland went as far as to say that he had something wrong with his face, like he had some sort of markings on his face. This is the common description we get of the man who was seen with Oswald everywhere from Bolton Ford to the Carousel Club to you name it. Oswald was constantly seen with this husky Latino with what I call a pockmarked face. Well, that husky Latino with a pockmarked face is unquestionably 100% of the time Lawrence Howard. That man was seen on the 6th floor of the book depository in the sniper's nest. Okay, so if Lawrence Howard is in the sniper's nest, who are Lawrence Howard's buddies? The 2 people who he ran with consistently between 61 and the assassination are William Seymour and Loren Hall. Loren Hall was the other shooter on the 6th floor. Loren Hall used a Johnson 30-06 rifle that was found in Dealey Plaza and within 24 hours traced back to a guy in Los Angeles named Richard Hathcock, who owned Allied Detective Agency and who was associate of all these guys, Lawrence Howard and Hall and Jerry Hemming and all these guys. Right. And so what he'd done was he had the rifle. It was pawned to him, and he actually gave the rifle back to Loren Hall about a month before the assassination. And then a week before the assassination, he tells Richard Hathcock he's got to go to Dallas. Right. So, yeah, Loren Hall on the 6th floor with the 30-06 Johnson. On the roof of the depository was Sergio Arcacha Smith, where he fired a Mauser 7.65. The Mauser 7.65 was left on the roof in cover-up by Gary Shaw. He clearly indicates that the Dallas police acknowledged they found a Mauser 7.65 on the roof of the depository. They claimed it belonged to a security guard. So you have those 3 guys. Those are the 3 shooters in the book depository. William Seymour. Now, this is where it gets interesting. William Seymour was working in the book depository as Lee Harvey Oswald. Okay, there's zero evidence Oswald ever stepped foot in that building, and we can go through step by step and debunk all of the notions that Oswald ever went there. We can start off with Buell Frazier, who allegedly drove Oswald to work that day. That story is a complete fiction, and that fiction is debunked by a guy named Charles Shields. Charles Shields worked in the warehouse section of the book depository, which was further down Houston Street. You could see it like down the street from the book depository. But he saw Buell Frazier pull in and park his car, and he specifically asked Buell Frazier, hey, where's your rider? And Buell Frazier tells him, I dropped him off in front. So Buell Frazier telling Charles Shields, who testified this before the HSCA, that completely debunks the story that he ever drove Oswald to work that day, because he didn't. And when you get into the statements of Buell Frazier says that Oswald, when he drove him to work, was wearing a light gray flannel wool type jacket. Okay. Number one, Oswald doesn't own a flannel wool gray type jacket like that, but there's only one person in Dealey Plaza that day who is wearing that, and that's Alvin Bobouf. So I haven't really made the connection there why Buell Frazier would have any connection to Alvin Bobouf, but the description of the jacket, and of course Bobouf and Leighton Martins are in Dealey Plaza photographed. I have that photograph, and he's clearly wearing that jacket. So, but Buell Frazier's a liar. He never drove anybody to work that day. And then what's the other thing? The story about the second floor lunchroom with the Coke story, right? The biggest lie of the Kennedy assassination, and for good reason. That incident never happened. There never was an incident on the second floor. Oswald was never drinking a Coke. It's the dumbest story ever when you come to understand what really happened. And you go and you can understand what really happened by looking at a couple documents from on this incident written by Jesse Curry. And you can go back and you can look at the statement written by Baker, and you can read Baker's original handwritten notes where he acknowledges he ran into this person between the third and fourth floor in the stairwell. Had nothing to do with a Coke, and this person was wearing a light brown jacket. Okay, Oswald not wearing a light brown jacket allegedly till after the Tippit shooting, right? But we'll cover that here in a second. No, it was William Seymour. William Seymour was inside the building. So as the shots go down at exactly 12:30 and about 30 seconds, the back door flies open. Three men come rushing out. Sergio Arcacha, who comes down from the fire escape from the roof to the sixth floor, takes the elevator from the sixth floor down to the first floor. Now, let me pause again. I'm sorry I have to pause so often to preface stuff, but it's very important. The elevator is working at this time. But the elevator was killed by William Shelley, the boss of the book depository, or one of the bosses of the book depository, at 12:29. And we know that because of the statements of Geneva Hines. Geneva Hines, who was working on the second or third floor, she says everything went out at 12:29. Then after the shots are fired, we have the statements of Vicki Adams, who couldn't go to the elevator because the elevator was out. So Vicki Adams goes running down the stairs, right? So everyone always says that Vicki Adams is the proof that Oswald couldn't have shot Kennedy because he couldn't have run down the stairs and made it to the second floor lunchroom with a Coke in 90 seconds. Total propaganda. That is Oliver Stone grade propaganda. So the reality is she gets to the bottom of the stairs, and what does she see when she gets to the bottom of the stairs? She sees William Shelley and William Lovelady standing by the electric panel, okay? And then she goes running out the back door. And from there, William Shelley and Billy Lovelady go running into Dealey Plaza, but they're back inside the front door by 12:32 p.m. So they're only gone for about 90 seconds. So William Shelley killed the power of the building because he needed to make sure the elevator stayed on the sixth floor. And thank God he did, right? Because if he didn't, Vicki Adams would have pushed the button and it would have come from the sixth floor down, and the shooters would have been trapped on the sixth floor. So planning ahead, William Shelley working at the book depository, which is obviously a CIA front. I mean, come on, you're going to think that the government, the CIA, is going to let any Joe Schmo publish and distribute textbooks? Give me a break. Every business in that building was a CIA front, whether it's the Scott Forsman Company or Macmillan or the Southeastern Publishing Company. Those are all CIA at a minimum contractors, and at most CIA front companies. The whole hierarchy of the book depository was in on this thing. But yes, 12:33 out the back door comes Lawrence Howard, Sergio Arcacha, and William Seymour. Okay. You have Lawrence Howard and Sergio Arcacha leave in Lawrence Howard's green Nash Rambler station wagon. They circle around Houston, where eventually they will pick up Lauren Hall, but I'll get to that in a minute. So they leave in the car, and you have William Seymour, who now walks into Dealey Plaza and back into the railroad yards, and he is captured in the Robert Hughes film. He's captured in the Robert Hughes film, looking just like Oswald with his receding hairline, wearing what? A light brown jacket. Okay. The light brown jacket is the exact same light brown jacket that Oswald was allegedly wearing when he was stopped by Baker and Truly on the third and fourth floor. Now, I have to address the time frame. I completely rewrote the entire timeline surrounding the book depository because the current timeline doesn't make any sense. And if anyone thinks it makes sense, then that's why they haven't figured out who shot Kennedy in 60 years. So the book depository timeline, what you have is within the first 3 minutes, you got everything I just described with William Shelley, Billy Lovelady leaving to go into Dealey Plaza. Then they come back in. They're back in by 12:32 prior to 12:33. 12:33, allegedly Oswald is seen walking out of the book depository by whom? Robert McNeil. And Robert McNeil is the important one here because Robert McNeil is what helped me rewrite the entire timeline because he goes inside the building and he's looking for a phone. He gets a report back from his New York news desk. His phone call didn't occur till 12:36 p.m. He clearly states in his initial statements to Dallas Police Department that nobody was in that building at the time. There were no cops in that building. No police had entered prior to him leaving at 12:36, which puts the absolute earliest that the incident with Baker and Truly could have happened at 12:37, but I believe it was more likely 12:38. It did not occur in the second floor lunchroom with a Coke. It happened on the stairs between the third and fourth floors. And the fact that it happened so much later the story was changed because I believe that Baker made an arrest in Dealey Plaza immediately after he got off his motorcycle. If you watch the Malcolm Couch film, you can see Baker pulls up on his motorcycle. He gets off, and most people assume he runs to the book depository. He does not run to the book depository. He runs past the book depository to Houston Street, where I believe he made an arrest of the shooter at the Daltex building, Emilio Santana. He arrests Emilio Santana, and I believe that this is captured in the Willis 10 photo. In the Willis 10 photo, a subject dressed all in black who they had taken a rifle off of is being arrested directly in front of the book depository. This was made by Baker. This corresponds with Baker getting off his motorcycle, running past the book depository to Houston Street. This also explains why they had to fabricate the story about Oswald in the second floor lunchroom 90 seconds after the assassination, because they had to cover for the fact that Baker made an arrest and didn't make it into that building until 12:37. The incident on the stairs happens at 12:38. They detain William Seymour on the stairs where he's wearing the light brown jacket. Roy Truly then identifies this man as an employee, and it's not Oswald because Oswald ain't there. He identifies this man in the light brown jacket as an employee. And then at this time, they let him leave. William Seymour, wearing the light brown jacket, then continues down the stairs of the book depository, where he then exits through the side door and is seen by Roger Craig running down the slope and getting into the green Nash Rambler driven by the quote-unquote Negro, right? That's Lawrence Howard. This is the same photograph of Lawrence Howard that was shown to Roger Craig by Jim Garrison years later, because allegedly at some point Lawrence Howard is stopped and detained. And I have this photograph of Lawrence Howard being stopped and detained in Dealey Plaza that I can't seem to fit into the timeline. But yeah, I have no proof Oswald ever stepped foot in that book depository. It was a front job, just like all of his other jobs. And then once I put William Seymour at the book depository, both outside in the Robert Hughes film, matching the description of the man stopped on the stairs by Baker and Truly with the light brown jacket, it all fell into place. And I realized that when you go back through Oswald's life, you'll find that he was being impersonated. Well, we'll skip over John Armstrong's work on the early impersonations because that went from 47 till he left for. And I can't honestly. I've tried to poke holes in John Armstrong's data. I can't do it. His data is legit. One thing I can poke holes in are his conclusions. The conclusions he drew on his data are total garbage. Like, just everybody should read Harvey and Lee and just accept the data he found, but his conclusions are total garbage.
And I've heard that from other people. You're not the only one. I've heard quite a number of people say that they don't know that they agree with Armstrong in the end, but they love using his work almost as a timeline of the case.
Right. So what Armstrong did was that he came up with this idea that there was a duplicate Oswald being raised as a child from 47 all the way till he went to which I believe. I mean, to me, it seems like a very simple plot to get a spy into the Soviet Union using a child who spoke fluent Russian. And that coincides with the AE balcony documents, because the AE balcony documents, it shows that they were using naturalized American citizens, meaning not from America, but who spoke fluent Russian. Right. So that perfectly fits with Armstrong's theory that they plucked the kid out of a concentration camp or some Eastern Bloc country and raised him in America as Lee Harvey Oswald. 100% corroborated by the premise of A.E. Balcony. It's unbelievable. So, but yeah, his data is amazing. His conclusions are terrible because he believed that all of the second Oswalds were second Oswalds. So the second Oswald from 47 on, but that's false. I can tell you that the two Oswald plots started in 1961 at Bolton Ford. That was the first incident where we have Oswald who's being impersonated by either Kerry Thornley or William Seymour. So there's 100 incidents plus of Oswald being impersonated. I have gone through every single one of them.
So
all of them.
If the purpose of Oswald was to sort of raise him to be a spy, to go sort of in country in Russia and really sort of fit in as an American, then I'm just trying to wrap my head around this. I'm sorry to everyone out there who it seems like I'm lost at this point. I'm trying to wrap my head around this whole massive story, but where does that put Oswald on November 22nd of 1963 when JFK is shot?
Beats me. I have no goddamn clue at all. This is a void in my research that one day will have to be tackled, but nobody's tackled this. The closest that I can come up with is just from the old statements of Mae Brussels, who met with Donald P. Norton and said that he looked just like Lee Harvey Oswald, right? So there's a speculation that the other Oswald assumed the identity of Donald P. Norton, but that I don't put any weight behind that, and I don't put my name on that. It's just speculation that needs to be further researched. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, would they? What do you do when you get your spy into the Soviet Union with the original? I mean, there's also other documents showing that there's a Lee Harvey Oswald who was like a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps and stuff like that. So this, who knows? Who knows what happened? So Oswald is mostly a construct, right? So when you look at all the different incidents, particularly what started to really – the first incident that tipped me off that Oswald was really being impersonated and who it was at the Sportsdrome rifle range, right? So when you go through all the documents of the Sportsdrome rifle range, it becomes obvious that this person didn't go there once. They went there at least 3 or 4 times. They didn't go there alone. They went there with a large husky Latino with a dark complexion who was really hairy, who had big feet. Right. So who is it? It's William Seymour, obviously, because the guy he went there with was Lawrence Howard, who meets the description of the husky Latino, who Oswald is seen all over the place with. So that was the first time I really dug into this duplicate Oswald not being like a vague conspiracy theory, but being able to identify the person who was actually doing it. And so when you go through, let me see, Weisberg has a fantastic file called False Oswald, and it's got about 100 PDF files in it. And when you go through all of those, you can pretty much make a clear determination on who was impersonating Oswald where, and there were 2 of them. It was Kerry Thornley and William Seymour. And when you dig into the Kerry Thornley files, man, I swear to God, Kerry Thornley is like this guy is so arrogant and dumb. Like when you go through and read, he wrote a 50-page affidavit for Garrison. It's a confession. Straight up, it's a confession. Like, he names all the right people, all the right places, and it's like the assassination just happened to happen around him, and he didn't know any of it. Bullshit. He was so involved in the setup of Oswald. He was the one who had the flyers printed from Douglas Jones at Jones Printing for Fair Play for Cuba Committee. He's the one who stamped the 544 Camp Street address on it, not Oswald. I don't believe Oswald was ever associated with anybody at 544 Camp Street. All of the sightings of Oswald in New Orleans, other than the ones we have on film, right, on the street corner handing out the flyers and the interviews on TV, all of the other sightings of Oswald were Kerry Thornley. Plain and simple, particularly when you see him hanging around certain establishments like the Ryder Coffee House or the Bourbon House, right? There's a whole bunch of different places that Kerry Thornley is known to frequent that Oswald was witness at. Well, no, clear as day, it was never Oswald being seen there. It was always Kerry Thornley. And Kerry Thornley makes this pretty obvious in his affidavit to Jim Garrison. That 50-page affidavit everyone needs to read. It is straight up a confession. He talks about how he knows Johnny Roselli and all this stuff. Oh, by coincidence, of course, right? He knows all these people involved in the assassination by coincidence. He even goes as far as to name Leopoldo, who was Lawrence Howard, right? Because the Sylvia Odio incident was clearly Lawrence Howard, Lauren Hall, and William Seymour, right? And so then Kerry Thornley acknowledges his association with Leopoldo in his confession to Jim Garrison, right? So he gives Garrison so many dots to connect. And Garrison connected him. Garrison knew that Kerry Thornley shot J.D. Tippit. When you go to Kerry Thornley's primary file in the Jim Garrison papers, you open it up on page 1 is a little index card, and it mentions J.D. Tippit. On page 2 is the incident at Douglas Jones Printing about the flyers. So Garrison knew that Kerry Thornley was impersonating Oswald. Garrison knew Kerry Thornley, and he knew that he's the one who had the flyers printed. He knew that Oswald was basically being manufactured by Kerry Thornley. And the only other person in New Orleans I can connect directly to Oswald is Clay Shaw, because we have the real Oswald's aunt, Marette, who basically gave a statement to Garrison that Clay Shaw came to her house after Oswald moved to New Orleans. What was that? Would have been in like April of '63, right? So yeah, so we have the only connections that we can make definitively with Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans are to Kerry Thornley and Clay Shaw. And also there's even that photograph of the Civil Air Patrol with Oswald. There is some speculation that Oswald was never in that unit, that he was just a friend of Vobel and was just hanging out that day and was never actually in that unit. So, right. So there's no really definitive connection we can say there with Oswald and David Ferry. But we can definitely say it with Kerry Thornley and Clay Shaw. And those were Oswald's handlers in New Orleans. I have no doubts. And my theory is that they kept Oswald out of town. He was out doing stuff in other parts of the country, probably for the FBI or whoever the hell he was working for at the time. And that when he was out of town, they were setting him up. Like, that's what was going on. Like 99% of a construct.
Cory, have you ever looked into Marina Oswald, the purpose of Lee meeting Marina in Russia and then easily bringing her back to Texas? What was her purpose? Do you think she just sort of happened to be an innocent bystander in the story? I guess victim is the contemporary word of the day. Or do you believe that there is much more to this relationship?
So she was. I don't understand why he needed to bring a wife back in the first place. I mean, if you're a spy, you're going to, just be happy to get the hell out of there, just to be extracted. Because in the AE Balcony program, I can tell you that they have references that some of their agents were unable to be extracted. Okay, so they lost people in some of these programs. So if you're a spy and you're in the Soviet Union, you've been there 2 years, I would be counting your lucky stars you didn't get popped and get the hell out of Dodge. To even attempt to bring a wife back is raising so many red flags. So I have another associate who's solved Kennedy years ago, but doesn't ever talk about it. And we've had discussions about this. And for me, see, Marina wasn't the first. Oswald tried to marry some other chick and she rejected him. And then he literally got married to Marina 2 weeks later. So the whole thing with Marina was set up. What I think happened was that the KGB, this is pure speculation. I think the KGB knew he was a false defector from day one. They kind of, they kept an eye on him the whole time. And I think they set him up with another spy to bring back as a kind of screw you to the CIA. You're going to try to pull one on us? Oh, well, here, we'll pull one on you. Because her uncle was like the number 2 guy in the KGB or something like that, right? Some crazy connection to intelligence. So the idea that he could get a bride out of the Soviet Union in the 60s is insane. The whole thing was an intelligence op for sure. Was it a counterintelligence op? I think it was. I think they sent her because she was like another spy. But I think as soon as he gets back, they basically got with her and were like, yeah, this is the deal. And she was in on the setup from day one. It was her handwriting on for the signature for Alec Heidel on the Selective Service card. It was her handwriting on the back of the photograph of Oswald with the rifle, allegedly, that said "Hunter of Fascists," right? So she was in on it. It was her handwriting setting him up for this stuff. Plus, this is key. There are many incidents that puzzle Kennedy researchers, whereas Oswald is seen with his wife who's pregnant and a daughter, right, June. But Oswald is like a snide asshole and he's driving a car. Okay. And this brings us to like the gun shop in Dallas. There's a couple other places in Dallas where Oswald is seen driving a car and he's with Marina. Well, that was Kerry Thornley. And I realized that was Kerry Thornley when I realized that when Oswald was married to Marina and living at Magazine Street, they had a neighbor. I can't ever remember her name. I think it was a Hispanic name, but it was a woman who, when Garrison or Weisberg talked to her, she said that she was shown pictures of Oswald and Thornley. She said that she saw both men over there so often she didn't know which one of them was married to Marina, right? So that to me filled in 100 gaps. All of the incidents. So she's setting up Oswald. She has a relationship somehow with Kerry Thornley, and Oswald knows Kerry Thornley also. And this is confirmed by the neighbor of Oswald on Magazine Street. So, they all go to Dallas. Kerry Thornley goes to Dallas. Oswald is seen firing rifles off of the aqueduct at bales of hay. Most people don't talk about this incident, but he's seen with a light blue station wagon, obviously Ruth Payne's, and he's seen with a pregnant woman and a child while he's shooting bales of hay. He did things to draw attention to himself while he was with Marina, like going to that furniture store, asking about the gun shop, right? So yeah, Marina was in on this from the beginning, in on it from the jump. And then when Oswald gets fucking popped, she says, what does she say? Oh, I knew he was like they said in the JFK film, right? You know, they put new dresses on her and wheel her out in front of the camera and tell her what to say. And that's exactly what they did. And then later on in life, when you look at some of the interviews of Marina as she got older, you can tell that she wanted to tell the truth and never did. So
in your research, how would you assess the roles of Ruth and Michael Payne?
They're just babysitters, if you ask me. Obviously, both of them are connected to CIA. I mean, Michael Payne was working with Bell Helicopter, and his stepfather was the owner of Bell Helicopter. And then you had Ruth Payne, whose father was like directly CIA. You know, like they're CIA families. They were babysitters, right? That's it. That's all they were meant to do, if you ask me. Same thing with George de Mohrenschildt. He was just another babysitter. But Oswald got too close to George de Mohrenschildt, so they had to send him back to New Orleans, right? I mean, you can't have this communist hanging out with a bunch of white Russians who are all anti-communist, right? So it didn't make any sense in the storyline. So he ends up getting sent back to New Orleans until when? He's there until September 27th, allegedly.
Well, before we get to the sort of LBJ cadre of, I'll just say associates, let's stay in New Orleans and Dallas just a little longer. You mentioned Gary Shaw earlier. I really like Gary. He's been doing a lot of work recently on the Roscoe White case for a new book. What do you think about the Roscoe White angle?
No, it's total propaganda, total disinformation, COINTELPRO. The same thing with all the James Files stuff, right? The Jimmy, like, give me a break. That stuff is so dumb. Like, I can't believe anybody would be like, I would be so embarrassed to even mention that, like, in a serious context. But that's all COINTELPRO. That's exactly what COINTELPRO is. False information put out, to obfuscate the trail.
So I never bought the James Files story either. I always thought it was patently ridiculous for a lot of reasons. But what do you think about those tied to him? The sort of Chauncey Holt angle, the E. Howard Hunt angle, all of that.
Yeah, Chauncey Holt I put in Dealey Plaza for sure, because there's an interview with Chauncey Holt where he says one thing that confirmed for me he was certainly there. It was, I think they call it like his deathbed interview or something, but like he talks about how all kinds of people were getting arrested, including someone who was dressed like a ninja. And sure as hell, I got a photograph of someone in Dealey Plaza dressed like a damn ninja, believe it or not. So yeah, I have no doubts he was there, but Chauncey Holt claims that he went there with Nicoletti, which is ridiculous. Nicoletti would not be a million miles from Dallas. Nicoletti killed a guy the week before up in Chicago named Foreman, and he was on the lam. So who the hell is going to be on the lam and then show up in Dallas when the president gets killed? Nobody. So his story, he either didn't know Nicoletti, but he also said that he drove in Danny Green and he drove in somebody else, Leo Masseri. So he puts Leo Masseri as having driven in from the Licavoli's ranch in Phoenix. But unless he didn't know Nicoletti, he lied about Nicoletti, because Nicoletti sure as hell was not there.
I want to ask you about for sort of nondescript figures, because I know for a fact that you think they're a distraction and that it's not important. But I think there are a lot of people out there who are still wondering, especially after hearing an hour of us, what your take on them are. That's Doorway Man, that's Prayer Man, that's Umbrella Man, and that's the Babushka Lady. What is your take? What are your opinions on these sort of popular, I guess, characters in the field?
Yeah, well, let's talk about Umbrella Man. We can talk about the Umbrella Man. So the dark-complected man and the Umbrella Man are Ahmed Dalimi and Michael Harari. So Ahmed Dalimi, this one becomes kind of obvious, but you're never going to figure it out studying Kennedy. And this is like one of my biggest problems with Kennedy researchers. They think they can figure out Kennedy by studying Kennedy. No, sorry, you can't. If you don't understand the last 100 years of history leading up to the assassination, you'll never figure out anything. And Ahmed Dalimi is a perfect example. Ahmed Dalimi is the dark-complected man. He was a Mossad assassination coordinator. He was a general in the Moroccan army, and eventually they kill him. All the loose ends got tied up, and Ahmed Dalimi gets whacked. But he was a member of the Safari Club with George Bush in 1979. And when you come to understand what he was doing in the early 1960s, it becomes brutally obvious he was the dark-complected man, not Roy Hargraves or whoever else they try to put in that position. But yeah, and the Michael Harari was actually identified by Michael Collins Piper, believe it or not. Michael Collins Piper did a good job of identifying the Umbrella Man as Michael Harari, who was another Mossad spy, because Israel was behind the assassination. I mean, we haven't even touched on that, but the CIA works for Israel. They take their orders from Tel Aviv. And that goes back to post-World War II deal with Reinhard Gehlen. And that brings into like the post-war Nazis, because everyone thinks that the Nazis lost World War II. Ha! What a joke. No. Before Paperclip, the United States government funneled somewhere in the neighborhood of 230,000 card-carrying Nazis out of Europe and North Africa into South America. This went on to become the core of what's called the Gehlen Organization, which was like a large-scale, massive spy operation that got absorbed into the CIA by 1947. Believe it or not, Reinhard Gehlen, who was Adolf Hitler's spy master, he's the man who basically gave Dulles and Angleton and these guys the blueprint for intelligence globally. He designed the security state we live under today, including NATO and the 17 agencies that all launched in 47, all the brainchild of Reinhard Gehlen, Adolf Hitler's spy master, who at this time is working with Alan Dulles in the CIA. I even suspect that Gehlen had a role in the actual architecture of the assassination, like how it actually went down, like, because that was what he did.
Well, the Nazi that we've heard tied to the case most recently being the last, 10 to 15 years, is Otto Skorzeny. Anything about him?
Oh, yeah. He was in Dealey Plaza, too. Thank God for Hank Albarelli, who wrote some of the most amazing books. Hank died recently, but he's got the High Strangeness in the Kennedy Assassination, which goes into some of the crazy, weird coincidence background stuff. But then you got Coup in Dallas, where he identified the Corsicans who came into town that were talked about by like E. Howard Hunt on his deathbed, but they weren't assassins. You see, what they did was they had so many people come to town who were known assassins, like the Corsicans. The Corsicans flew in through Montreal down through New York and were traced down into Dallas. And a lot of the photographs of people in Dealey Plaza, I believe, are some of these unidentified hitmen who were flown into town. That you can read about in Coup in Dallas by Hank Albarelli. He did a fantastic job identifying them, and he puts it's funny because I thought I found a picture of Otto Skorzeny in Dealey Plaza, but I'm like, nah, probably wouldn't him. And then sure enough, Albarelli puts Skorzeny in Dallas. So yeah, it's pretty amazing. It was a who's who. Like, they all had to be there. Shackley was there. Joannidis was there. Morales was there, obviously. I don't know if you've seen my work on the Knoll shooter yet, but Morales was there. They were all there. It was a staged event. It was the pinnacle staged event in a long series of staged events. Everything, including like the Tippit shooting, a prearranged staged event. The Texas Theater, prearranged staged event. What we witnessed in the Kennedy assassination, including Oswald's employment, including Oswald's residences at the boarding houses that he never stayed at. This is a theatrical production that was cast, that was shot, and incorporated instead of into a movie, into history. Like, that is the Kennedy assassination in a nutshell. A theatrical production that was stretched out over several years and written into the history books as opposed to being put out into a theater, including the assassination itself, where all of these guys, including Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir and Rabin. Rabin was in Dallas. You know that, right? Like, his wife wrote about it in her memoirs, how they flew out of Dallas that day, and then they couldn't believe it when they got home and they found out Kennedy got killed. Really? So, yeah, Yitzhak Rabin, Shamir, Begin were all in Dallas. It was a Mossad operation because the CIA takes their orders from Tel Aviv. That's the relationship.
Well, now we've come to sort of what is, your wheelhouse, and that's the LBJ men. Now, in this community, we pretty much hear of four aides or four friends of LBJ quite often. We hear about Billy Solestes, we hear about Mac Wallace, we hear about Bill Moyers, and we hear about Jack Valenti.
Yeah.
Because this is your wheelhouse, I want you to take us, if you would, through a pretty deep dive into these characters that surrounded LBJ, or that LBJ had surround him, and their roles in Dallas on that day, if any. So I'm just going to put my feet up, sit back, and have you go at it, Cory. Thank you.
Sure. Estes and Mac Wallace are more distractionary nonsense. Most certainly, LBJ had a hitman, and it was Jack Valenti. There is a fascinating, this is one example. I'm going to give one example real quick. So after after Valenti is out of the White House, I believe it's 1968 at this point, he files a police report. Okay. He files a police report that he took a flight and that some stuff was stolen out of his bag. And when you look at the items that were stolen out of his bag, it's obvious he was sending like cryptic messages, right? Like he said that stolen was a set of cufflinks that had the presidential seal and would be identifiable with the presidential seal, and that they were 5/8 of an inch. And another set of cufflinks that was stolen also had the presidential seal and were 6/8 of an inch, and that neither set are any longer in circulation because they contain the president's seal. Well, they didn't. I trust me. I spent like a week on those goddamn cufflinks. They don't exist. Those cufflinks don't exist. Okay, Johnson. The timing of when he released cufflinks and the size of them did not match the police report that Jack Valenti had issued about his 5/8 and 6/8 inch cufflinks being stolen. What that was I believe Johnson had the hit list of 8 people, and that Jack Valenti took out 5 and 6 of 8 on the list. That's what I think that was. It was a covert message being sent via a police report, which is in the Jack Valenti file. Now, why would I believe that Jack Valenti is a hitman? Well, because he lied about his record. The podcast that I do is called Cory Hughes Bloody History. Last week and for the next 2 weeks, all I'm talking about is Jack Valenti. And I'm going over the actual 600 pages of his file in excruciating detail. And when you do that, you come to find out that he just lied about everything. He lied about his high school. He lied about his college stuff. He lied about everything, and then eventually he goes. He's like a BC student in college, the University of Houston. He ends up applying to Harvard Business School, where he gets rejected because he's a BC student. Well, he ends up flying up there for a weekend, and at the end of the weekend, not only is he accepted into Harvard, he's accepted into an honors program that he knocks out in 18 months, where he forms tight relationships with who would go on to become his lifelong handler post 66, and that's Henry Kissinger. And so. The story of Jack Valenti, God, I honestly could be here for hours telling you about Jack Valenti's life, about how his father, Joe Valenti, has like 50 FBI files, everything from treason to faking American citizenship, you name it. Jack Valenti actually has 3 FBI files, one for white slave trade, which actually was what they would when you took someone over the state lines to have an abortion in the 60s, that's what they would call that. Plus, there's a couple other things that Jack Valenti did on behalf of Lyndon Johnson. Like he took Lyndon Johnson's secretary, Mary Margaret Wiley, to have an abortion. And I believe that abortion was actually done by Jack Martin, Edward Suggs, because at the exact same time, Edward Suggs was wanted for doing these backroom abortions. And these guys are all connected at the time, right? So you really see that when you get through like 63 and the assassination itself. But Valenti and Jack Ruby, they knew, and David Ferry, these guys all knew each other. Jack Valenti had worked for Carlos Marcello and Joe Marcello running pornography between New Orleans and Houston before he was an anybody, right? So Jack Valenti is like the epitome of like, looks like he has this shiny veneer on the outside, but underneath really is a total mobster scumbag. But Jack Valenti eventually goes on to marry Mary Margaret Wiley, who is Lyndon Johnson's secretary. Okay, but he's gay. He's a beard. He got busted having an affair with McGeorge Bundy, and there were informants telling the FBI that Jack was having all kinds of affairs with other men. Right. So ultimately, he's a beard, and he marries Johnson's love of his life. Mary Margaret Wiley was Johnson's lifelong love, and so all of Valenti's kids are actually Lyndon Johnson's kids. And if you ask me, make no mistake about it, Jack Valenti was Lyndon Johnson's boss the entire time that he was in the White House. And that becomes evident when you read the statements of people who had never heard of Valenti. And then Valenti became an instant gatekeeper on November 22nd. Nobody got to talk to Johnson unless they went through Valenti first. And so, yeah, then there's some fascinating documents about Valenti requesting the audio transcripts of Air Force One that day. Johnson gets angry as hell and denies all requests. Because he knew what they talked about on the plane. So, yeah, Valenti is the shadiest character who then in 1966 is basically he's run out of the White House. It's not sold to us this way, but in 1966, there's a murder of a guy down in Miami named Mosler. I guess it was a big case. It was as big as the OJ case was in the 90s, I guess, back in the 60s. And Mosler is this rich guy in Miami, and he's married to this like woman who's like a third of his age. He's like 70 something. He marries like a 20 something year old, and Candy Mosler. And eventually there's a trial. Candy Mosler and her boyfriend on the side. I think they're found not guilty. There was never enough evidence. But Mosler gets stabbed like 60 times, murdered. Mosler's roommate at the time was Vincent Caltagirone Jr., who I've already said was the real Raoul and who was Jack Valenti's former brother-in-law. This actually hit the newspapers in 1966, and within a hop, skip, and a jump, Valenti was out of the White House. So I have no doubts he got forced out at the last minute because the relationship to Raoul started to become known, and it was too close to home. So he ends up leaving in 1966, and what does he do? He goes on and takes over the Motion Picture Association of America, where he created the movie rating system in 1968. Okay. Jack Valenti, the man who shot the president from the grassy knoll, is the man who created the movie rating system. He was the man who oversaw 100% of Hollywood's propaganda that you and I grew up on. The most important man in American history that no one's ever heard of. I guarantee it. Yep.
What about Bill Moyers? Where does he fit in?
I have an associate who says Moyers was involved and was responsible for the removal of the bubble top and all that, but I've got some contradicting information on the bubble top. I mean, it was obviously Kennedy's decision not to use it, so I don't really put too much weight there. But Moyers and Valenti were good friends at the time. Moyers, he did a stint in the Peace Corps, right? So yeah, Moyers is CIA also. All these guys are intelligence. I mean, post 56 with Mockingbird, the CIA scooped up everybody. Mockingbird wasn't just the media; it was people who gave the information to the media, right? So it was the entire hierarchy, and sure, he was definitely a CIA. But one thing I need to really emphasize is like the relationship. People need to study the Galen Organization if you want to understand why America takes their orders from Israel, because it's fact. We're bombing 17. We bombed 17 countries in the last 20 years, not for anything for us, but for Israel's sovereignty in the Middle East. Right. So ultimately, the assassination was over Dimona, and it becomes easily provable over Dimona when you go back and you study the Battle of Letters. When you read the documents on Israel's nuclear program from 1960, when it got outed by Time magazine, all the way through the assassination, you can tell it was a weekly priority for Kennedy. Nothing was more important in the world to him than getting rid of nukes. And he was even talking to Khrushchev about that. And then you got these fucking Israelis who come out of nowhere, who stole their plutonium or uranium from us, right? So you have the Numek incident, 1956 to 1965. Zalman Shapiro steals 600 pounds of uranium, right, from us to ship to Dimona. That gets whitewashed by the CIA, of course. This connects to the sinking of the Thresher and the Scorpion, which were Israeli sabotage, right? Which connects to Guy Bannister and the ADL and Schlumberger down in New Orleans. The Israelis call the shots. And if you ask me, America came to a screeching halt on November 22nd, 1963, when Israel implanted their puppet as president, and he gave the keys to the kingdom over to them, with Jack Valenti waiting in the wings as his handler. That's my perception on the relationships there. But
we also know that Angleton has a statue or something. Is that what it is?
A forest.
Also in Israel?
He's got a forest. It's a dinky little forest. It was done on purpose to give him the snub. All these guys, and this is something that I kind of, there's no real open why to this, but when you go back and you study Donovan and Dulles and Angleton, these guys were diehard Zionists from day one. And I don't really understand why. The only thing I can really kind of assume is that Israel is supposed to be the new world superpower when the new world order takes over. That's what I've concluded. Because I mean, when you look at the last 20 years, Israel has done nothing but try to recruit our tech companies. They've gotten Microsoft to have headquarters there. They've gotten Pentium, Intel. Like they've spent 20 years stealing tech companies and having them open up headquarters in Israel. This to me is all part of this long-term plan. And you'll see what's going on in society today, all this communism they're pushing on us today, right? All this absolute societally undermining things that they're pushing on us, like all this transgender nonsense, right? This is not like some organic movement of equal rights. This is communism that is formulated and written about openly by Marxists 100 years ago, how to undermine societies by implementing, sexual perversion and things like this. This is the communist playbook being laid out. And make no mistake about it, Israel and organizations like the Jewish Agency and AIPAC, and back in the day, all the Zionist congresses. This is what I call the global Jewish establishment. Make no mistake about it. This conglomeration of alliances that is pushing the New World Order, that is doing this to us today in America, and that undoubtedly killed Kennedy. And it ain't the CIA. They're middlemen. They're fucking middlemen.
Now, I know you have more on the grassy knoll, so let's return there.
Yeah, so there were two shooters on the grassy knoll. There was David Ferry, who I explained did the throat shot and then left. And then there is Jack Valente, who fired the headshot. Now, this becomes blatantly obvious when you go through the photographs of the incidents that happened immediately after. And you'll find particularly McIntyre photo number 1 and McIntyre photo number 2. When you look at McIntyre photo number 1, it's clear that the Secret Service guys lied and that they picked up a passenger in Dealey Plaza, that passenger being David Morales. And then when you get to McIntyre photo number 2, it's clear the second passenger they picked up was Jack Valente, who was the shooter on the grassy knoll. Now, when you have the Secret Service car pull into Dealey Plaza, it's got 10 men on it. Okay, 2 of them get off. Dave Powers gets out because he knows what's coming. And then Clint Hill runs to the limousine. So there's only 8 men supposed to be on that Secret Service car. However, by the time you get to McIntyre photo number 2, they're back to having 10 men on the car. All 8 men that were on the car, including Reedy and Paul Landis, who were on the side of the passenger side of the Secret Service car, they're accounted for and sitting inside of the Secret Service car at this point. And then as the vehicle passes through the underpass, they picked up a second passenger, Jack Valente. This is all very clear as day. It's probably the best photograph that you could see as far as identifications go. But yeah, the McIntyre photo number 2 clearly has Jack Valente and David Morales on the side of the Secret Service car heading to Parkland Hospital, where Jack Valente will then plant the magic bullet. And the magic bullet, let's talk about that real quick, was originally a .303. It was not a Carcano round. It was a .303 round. It was found by Daryl Tomlinson and O.P. Wright. They then turn it over to Richard Johnson of the Secret Service. Richard Johnson then turns it over to the head of the Secret Service. Head of the Secret Service turns it over to the FBI. The FBI then sends men back to Parkland in 66 to re-identify the bullet that was found. And at this point, they show them the picture of the magic bullet. O.P. Wright swears, and he's a hunter, so he would know, this is not the bullet that we found. We found a pointed tip bullet from a .303. And where else in the story of Kennedy do we come across a .303, particularly an Enfield .303 that would fire pointed tips? In the story of the arrest of Buell Frazier. When Buell Frazier's arrested, they arrested him with an Enfield .303 and a whole bunch of pointed tip .303 ammo that matched what the original magic bullet was as per O.P. Wright. So they were setting up Buell Frazier as a second patsy. And now who could have planted this .303 bullet? Well, Jack Valente, of course. Jack Valente, after shooting the president, going over the top of the knoll, being picked up by the Secret Service car, makes his way to Parkland Hospital, where we have numerous confirmations of him putting himself in the basement. He puts himself in the basement of Parkland Hospital, where he is found by Cliff Carter. Cliff Carter then takes him to Johnson, and Johnson then has him go to Air Force One. That's the series of events. So the bullet, a pointed tip .303, which is what took off Kennedy's head, is found in Parkland Hospital on the stretcher planted by Jack Valente. And then later it is swapped by the FBI for the Carcano round because they realized they didn't need to set up Buell Frazier at all. They just didn't have to. They had another guy named Gilberto Lopez they were setting up as an additional patsy as well. Gilberto Lopez was associated with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, obviously CIA guy, photographed in Dealey Plaza. That day he crosses over at Brownsville into Texas. The next day he catches a flight to Cuba. Obvious they're setting up additional patsies in case they needed them, but they didn't need them. So but yeah, that's how the knoll came about, and that's how I figured out the story of the grassy knoll.
Now, we would like to have you back on in a couple months at the very latest.
Sure.
But we want to give all of our listeners a little bit of time to digest what you have said, maybe do a little research on their own, and formulate some really good questions. We have a very smart, astute audience, and I'm sure they'll have some things that they would love to ask you, and I'll be happy to do so for them. But I want to get something straight because I think there may be a little confusion from earlier. Did you say that Jack Ruby did not shoot Oswald?
No, he did shoot Oswald. Jack Ruby is alleged to have been at the police department, photographed in the police department, and then he's then again actually caught on film at the Dallas Morning News, where he's talking on the phone in the background, and also he's at the midnight press conference. Kind of strange Jack Ruby happened to make it onto television 3 times in a 12-hour period, right? Wouldn't you say? Yeah, just because he was establishing an alibi because it wasn't Jack Ruby. It was Samuel Ruby establishing an alibi for his nearly identical brother Jack, who had gone to Galveston.
So I guess I don't understand. If Oswald was just a spy and had no part in this at all, why did they need him dead?
Well, I believe Oswald was supposed to die in the Texas theater. Then you wouldn't have had to have anything. Oswald was supposed to die in the Texas theater. So there's another aspect to this we haven't talked about. We're probably not going to talk about today, but there is an occultic ritual aspect to Dealey Plaza that we'll have to talk about next time. And this kind of ties into it also. But there were several deaths, right? There were 3 total deaths, right? There was Kennedy, Oswald, and Tippit. Part of the, I don't even know how to say this, but part of this occultic ritual stuff is during assassination. This is pure speculation, okay? I'm just going way out on a tangent here. But if you look at it from an occult ritual perspective, they would do assassination or sacrifices, and sometimes they would do them in different numbers representing different things. And 3 assassinations would equal the 3 pillars, which is this like Freemason type thing. But like I said, that's just me going off on a tangent, probably incorrect. But Oswald had to die because what would he have told them eventually? He said he was a patsy, and that was correct. Eventually, he would have told them everything because he calls his handler, John Hurt, who's a cutout, right, for his true handler. Actually, I have an associate who identified Oswald's real naval intelligence handler. By total coincidence, actually happened to work with his son. And was given the full story on Oswald's connection to naval intelligence and his ultimate handler through John Hurt. But yeah, he had to die because, I mean, he would have told him everything. And that's why he had to die. And so Jack Ruby shoots him based on the order given by Al Gruber. So after Oswald's arrested, the first call that Ruby makes is to Al Gruber. Al Gruber was the right-hand man of Mickey Cohen, and Mickey Cohen's in jail at this time. But Mickey Cohen, who did Mickey Cohen take orders from? Mickey Cohen took orders from Menachem Begin and the Israelis who were living in Los Angeles at the time. Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir confirmed to have been in Los Angeles 3 weeks before the assassination. What else happened 3 weeks before the assassination with an associate of theirs? Well, Al Gruber goes to Dallas to meet with Jack Ruby, right? So the way I see it, orders to hand off to Jack Ruby are given from Menachem Begin and the Israelis directly to Al Gruber, who's working on behalf of Mickey Cohen and the LA mob. He then goes to meet with Jack Ruby 3 weeks before the assassination. Then as soon as Oswald gets arrested, the first call he makes is to Al Gruber. Al Gruber obviously gave him the order to kill Oswald. People tried to make all kinds of other speculation, but there's not even a trail leading anywhere else.
Well, right. So now I do have to ask, who was Oswald's actual handler?
I think that, like deep cover handler, I don't know his name. Obviously, so, you have a last resort handler. You have handlers who are handling your operations, but then you have a handler like, oh my God, shit's hitting the fan. I gotta get out of this. That's when you call your like ultimate handler, right? And that's who his ultimate handler up in Nag's Head would have been. But I believe he was being handled directly by Kerry Thornley and Clay Shaw in New Orleans.
Well, you said that you knew someone whose father worked with Oswald's actual handler.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear that story. Yeah,
I'll tell you the story. So Ryan Dawson, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Ryan Dawson. He's mostly a 9/11 guy, but he's been like my mentor on Kennedy stuff, but he won't publicly talk about Kennedy for some reason. Personally, he's from North Carolina, and his father owned a company and employed a guy that he worked with. And this person he employed turned out to be the son of Oswald's real naval intelligence handler. He won't give me his identification. It's going to be in his book when it comes out. But he has identified this person, identified him, knew him, had like long conversations with him about it when he met him. So, yeah, 100% Oswald was ultimately naval intelligence, probably on loan to the CIA. Because look at Guy Bannister. He was always ONI, but he was working with the CIA. There's not a mutual exclusivity there, you know?
Well, I have to admit it, I'm still a little baffled by the Oswald story as a whole anyway. And the stickler, the problem I've always had is that he goes home and he grabs the gun. So what is the ultimate reason for grabbing the gun? I don't know, but that's always been sort of a sticking point for me.
Well, if you say that, then you're assuming Oswald lived there, but Oswald didn't live there. Oswald couldn't have lived there. Let me explain the Tippit shooting and how that series of events had to have gone down. So we don't know anything about Oswald, and we know that during the time he was supposed to be living at the North Beckley boarding house, he actually spent like 21 nights out of like 30 staying at the Payne's house, right? So of all the 6 weeks that he was supposed to have been there from beginning of October through November 22nd, he only stayed there less than 7-8 times, right? So that's you can determine by comparing the known record of when he stayed at the Payne's house, right? So you're like, well, wait a minute. So the person we know as Oswald is actually staying up at the Payne's house, but we have witnesses at the boarding house who have seen this person pretty consistently there the whole time, right? So, but it's not Oswald. You have to make the connection between the person who shot J.D. Tippit as being the person who lived at the boarding house. And obviously, based on the relationships, it was Kerry Thornley who shot J.D. Tippit. That also, when you realize that it was Kerry Thornley who was staying at all the boarding houses, and that it was Kerry Thornley impersonating Oswald not only in New Orleans but also at certain places in Dallas, like at the auto insurance dealer. He goes to an auto insurance dealer, tells him before the assassination he's about to get a car, he's going to get some money, and he wants to do all the paperwork now. And the guy's like, well, you can't do anything until you get a car, so come back, right? And he gives the name of Lee Oswald, right? Definitely not Lee Oswald. It's Kerry Thornley dropping hints all over the place, kind of leaving this trail. And on the day of the assassination, so the timeline is also screwed up with Tippit. The official timeline has Tippit getting shot at 1:16 p.m., but that's false. He was shot at 1:06 p.m. And we know this because of numerous witnesses. So this is the series of events. You have the cab, William Whaley. He drops off a person between 12:45 and 12:47. Okay, I narrowed down the timeline based on the statements of Whaley and when he picked up the person from where the buses were, right? Now, I believe this person to be Alvin Bobouf. I'll talk about this another time, but he's the only person who matches the description, wearing the same heavy wool coat in the cab that Buell Frazier claims that Oswald was wearing that morning, right? So, but anyway, that really is kind of irrelevant to the point I'm making. Between 12:45 and 12:47, this guy is out of the cab, okay? We don't have someone showing up at the boarding house until 1:01 p.m., so you got about 15 minutes for allegedly Oswald to make a walk that should take 2 minutes tops. So what is the implication here? Where does this person go for more than 10 to 12 minutes? Obviously, there is another safe house in the area. There's no other explanation to account for this disappearance of 12 minutes or so. So this person, I believe is Alvin Bobouf, goes to this other safe house, which I actually believe was the house directly next door, 1018 North Beckley. So I believe that Kerry Thornley was waiting at this other boarding house. When the person walked into boarding house, remember, all this is on a schedule. This has to be done on time because they have the Texas Theater incident set up. They've got people meeting Oswald allegedly at the Texas Theater. So all this has to be done on a very tight schedule. At this time, I believe, from this other boarding house from the other safe house in the area, Kerry Thornley then gets the signal. Everything is on time. He then, in his white T-shirt, walks over to the 1026 North Beckley boarding house at 1:01. Erling Roberts states that he is only there long enough to walk into his room, grab the jacket, and walk out. He then walks out wearing that light gray tan kind of looking jacket and allegedly a revolver, but it's not a revolver because 3 out of 4 shots were fired from a semi-automatic handgun, and they collected those casings at the scene. So it was a semi-automatic handgun that he ends up shooting Tippit with. But so it's 1:02 p.m. At 1:01, we have the honking of the horn by the 2 cops in vehicle 207, right? We're talking about Westbrook and Croy. They pull up in front of the boarding house. They honk the horn twice. Now, there is no possibility that Kerry Thornley could have made the walk from the boarding house to kill Tippit in 4 minutes, but he certainly could make it if he was driven there by Westbrook and Croy, which is exactly what happens. He walks out of the boarding house and he's picked up over by Zhang, by Westbrook and Croy. He's in the back seat. They pull up in the alley between 404 and 406 East 10th Street. They pull up in the alley. David Ferry is already waiting there. And we know this because of Frank Wright, a witness who says that the gray Plymouth that we had David Ferry leave the book depository in, owned by Carl Mathers, that is now parked directly behind Tippit's vehicle facing the opposite direction. So at 1:05 p.m., Westbrook and Croy, who are sitting in this cop car, drove Kerry Thornley there. Kerry Thornley gets out of the back seat, and then he walks up to the cop car, talks to Tippit through the triangular window, right? But if you'll remember, Kerry Thornley is not supposed to know Tippit. But Tippett will have seen Kerry Thornley not only that morning earlier in the day at the Top 10 record store, which would have confused the hell out of him, but he also had seen him previously at Austin's barbecue, and he had seen him at the diner on previous days. So we have at least 3 times that Tippett sees Kerry Thornley, right? But he's confused at this point. What the hell? Right? Because remember, he sits at the Gloco station waiting for someone to get off the bus. No one gets off the bus. He then panics and goes to the Top 10 record store where he makes a panicked phone call. Right? He's freaking out because the person he was supposed to arrest or shoot or whatever is not on the bus. So then he ends up at the alley at 10th and Patton, where he sees the guy who he's seen 2 or 3 times in the previous couple days. Maybe this is even supposed to be the person who was supposed to get off the bus. Right? But anyway, his plan is broken and he's scared at this point. So he exits his vehicle with his revolver. And at this point, Kerry Thornley shoots him 3 times in the chest. David Ferry, who is seen by not only Frank Wright, but Akilah Clemens and Doris Holland, he walks up and he fires 1 shot with a revolver to Tippett's right temple, just above the eye. And that's when Tippett falls to the ground. David Ferry gets in the gray Plymouth and then heads to the address on Belmont. From there, Kerry Thornley flees, attempts to get into the secondhand junk shop on Jefferson, where he's seen by Dorothea Dean at Dean's Dairy Way. And then from there, he goes to the Abundant Life Temple, hides out in there. The cops show up at the Abundant Life Temple, but he has already left by then. He leaves, and then at 12:36, he stops in front of Johnny Brewer's shoe store. Hardy's shoe store run by Johnny Brewer, but also inside the shoe store, you got Tommy Rowe, who's a close associate of Jack Ruby, who moves into Jack Ruby's apartment immediately after the assassination. And you have Igor Vaganov, who ends up providing the red Ford Falcon that Kerry Thornley will escape from the Texas Theater in. So, right. So when you get to the Texas Theater incident, you have Butch Burroughs, who acknowledges that Oswald entered the theater between 1 o'clock and 1:07. And I need to point out, this incident here at the Texas Theater with Lee Harvey Oswald is the very first time I am encountering Oswald in any of my research in real time. Okay. None of the incidents prior to this had I determined were ever Oswald. None of them. They were either William Seymour or Kerry Thornley setting up Oswald. This incident at the Texas Theater is the first time I have actually come across the real or the alleged Lee Harvey Oswald. Let me put it that way, because he's probably not even the real Lee Harvey Oswald. So this is the first time he's actually in a place where I can say this is the real him, right? The real person that we know was arrested on November 22nd. So what happens? Oswald goes into the theater. He then sits in front of a guy named Jack Davis. Jack Davis, 18-year-old kid. He says Oswald sits directly in front of him. He then gets up and then he sits directly next to him. This is a 900-seat theater, 22 people in the theater. Jack Davis is like, what is wrong with this guy? Why is he sitting directly next to me? He waits a couple minutes and he gets up. Oswald then goes and sits next to somebody else. Same thing. Sat there a couple minutes, and then he gets up and moves again. He does this 3 or 4 times until eventually he sits down next to a pregnant woman. He and the pregnant woman then get up and go to the lobby. The pregnant woman leaves. Oswald is then sold popcorn by Butch Burroughs at 1:15 p.m. Remember, Tippett is not even allegedly shot for another minute, but in reality, he was shot at 1:06. Oswald then goes back to the theater with his popcorn, sits there for more than a half an hour, eating his popcorn until the cops come in and raid the place. He gets taken out the front of the theater. Now, Butch Burroughs, he tells Jim Douglas. He tells Jim Douglas that within 3 or 4 minutes of Oswald being arrested and taken out the front, he sees another Oswald who looked alike. He said they could have been brothers. He said he sees him arrested and taken out the back of the theater. We have a witness to this, Bernard Hare, who ran Bernard's Hobby House directly next to the Texas Theater. He's in his shop. He sees the commotion. He goes out back. He sees what he believes is Lee Harvey Oswald arrested out the back of the theater. He's not even informed by the Houston Chronicle for 20 years that it wasn't Oswald, because Oswald was taken out the front. So we have confirmation of 2 Oswalds being arrested at the Texas Theater. And it's not a weird, crazy conspiracy mystery. It's Lee Harvey Oswald being taken out the front and Kerry Thornley being taken out the back after he had shot J.D. Tippett and fled to the Texas Theater. That's how the Tippett shooting went down And it all makes 100% perfect sense when then you then realize that the phone calls that were made from the Alamo Motel in Houston to WSHO radio and to WDSU television were to contact Kerry Thornley, who admits that he had contacts at both of those places in his statement to Garrison, right? So because David Ferry didn't see Kerry Thornley again after Thornley is taken out the back of the theater. Right. So David Ferry obviously then gets a hold of Arcacha and those guys in Houston, who then contacts WSHO and WDSU trying to get a hold of Kerry Thornley, because obviously he couldn't make the phone calls directly to New Orleans because that would have been incriminative. Right. So, yeah. So to me, this whole thing makes perfect sense. Like when you finally see the assassination for what it is, like when you put together a puzzle and you put that last piece in and you just take a step back and you look at it and you can see it all in its entirety. It's like, oh, my God, that's where I'm at with the assassination. I can see the entire thing in its entirety. And even when you look at the big picture, it helped fill in so many of the micro details, the little things. They're like, oh, my God, of course it was that guy if it was this guy over here. Right. So you have a lot of if this, then that. Right. If this happened, then that has to happen. And I was a cop for almost 10 years. That's one thing I never mentioned. I was actually a cop with I got 4 degrees. I got thousands of hours of actual training, and I've researched and investigated tens of thousands of actual cases and interviewed tens of thousands of witnesses. Like, I'm a law enforcement expert. So I put that knowledge to use when I applied it to Kennedy. And that's why I sit here today with you telling you that I solved this damn thing. Right. So I'm not winging it or guessing at any of this stuff.
Right. No. I told everyone in the beginning that you would absolutely bring information, even if they don't agree with the conclusions. And I think everyone has a lot to process. And this is why we're going to take a month or two and let it all sort of seep in and then have you back. But for anyone out there who's interested in finding out more about you, finding more of your work, how can they go about doing that?
Sure. CoryHughes.org is my website, but I'm gonna push my book here for a second. I'm pre-ordering my book. My book's available for pre-order right now. It's $25 you get for the ebook, and along with that, you get 4 chapters that are already written. But here's the big kicker: you get about 700 pages of my original notes that explain 10 times more than what's in the book alone. And you get all that for $25, and you can get that from buymeacoffee.com/JFK book. The book is actually, I'm on my last chapter. Actually, I'm halfway through my Kerry Thornley chapter, and I have the only chapter to go is on Jack Valente. But I understand the stuff I'm putting in that pretty well. It'll go pretty quickly. I'm assuming the book will be done in its entirety about 4 weeks from now, about mid-August. And so it should be on sale by the 1st of September. But the big push for the pre-order is my notes. Like, my notes are unbelievable. Like, when you go through my notes, it backs up everything I'm telling you. And that you're not going to be able to get once the book actually comes out. So.
Well, I know you've run into some brick walls with the JFK research community, as most people have that have some unique ideas to share and some deep research to share. There's, it's a bit of an ego game, and I'm sorry that you got sort of caught up in it with some others, but it does happen. It does happen to a lot of people. But we definitely thank you so much for accepting our invitation to be on the show. It was very kind of you to make time for us.
Yeah, I love talking JFK. This is my whole life. I mean, this is my life. This is what I'll be doing for the rest of my days. And so the things I'm looking into in Kennedy now, nobody even have a clue to look into. So.
Well, thank you so much for being on. It was really nice.
Hey, thank you for having me on.
I'm S.T. Patrick. This is the Midnight Rider News Show from the other side of the mountain on the best side of midnight. I wish you peace.
One man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. You only choose sides based upon the rhetoric. The truth is nefarious, the slow flow of evidence. It lies on both sides, gotta admire their cleverness. But the code of personality is venomous. The power keeps ascending, agendas are so treacherous. They 10 steps ahead of us, cementing their survival. And y'all just applaud and fall for these false idols who slither through the snake pits. Dark shadows and shape shift. Devalue the paper, less power for you to play with. State agents operating so flagrant. Suits and jackboots for us peasants and vagrants. Leviathan monster, federal mobsters. Socioeconomic warfare tactics divide and conquer. Stop and ponder for a minute how they prosper. Insert them in disguise and you don't realize what they sponsor. They rotate the scapegoats, stockpiles of banknotes. Control everything from lab coats to fake votes. Smile in your face when they strip you of your freedom. Continuously telling you lies, why you believe them. Government conditioning, dunk down education. The school to prison pipeline fueling incarceration. Speak in pursuit of the truth and be met with violence. Because one way or another they want to obtain your silence. Common sense questions they never want you to ask. Like how much can they take with some beer and a mask? And the ultimate hypocrisy is that they're spreading freedom and democracy by supporting corrupt corporate monopolies. Mainstream media ain't telling the truth either, but you entertained by their high-stakes kabuki theater. Pit us against each other, watch us burn it down to ashes. Just another way to gain influence over the masses. Military weapons on civilians, law enforcement, high-powered 50 caliber rounds used to serve warrants. With fully armored vehicles parked outside your doorstep.